Hi, this is Sergio Fant, Berlinale programmer. Today I'm very happy to be speaking with Jason Kohn, director of this year's official Berlinale Selection, Nothing Lasts Forever, and not even diamonds last forever, as we are learning from your film. And welcome and good morning. Hello, Jason.
Thank you very much. Hello, good morning. It's a little here in Los Angeles.
I know, thank you for that. Corruption and crime in Brazil, professional tennis, and now the diamond industry. You seem to have a fondness, a soft spot for complex, secretive power systems. What draws you to these stories?
You know, so for me, it's funny because it's not necessarily as much about corruption and complex systems, but maybe complex systems just because of the way that, I don't know, maybe I'm hardwired. But it actually has a lot more to do with a certain kind of international approach to story, because my family is, my parents are Latin American, and I kind of grew up in this weird world where I didn't always completely understand, who we were, and so my grandfather, I kind of grew up in this tiny little retail store in Midtown Manhattan, where I worked on the weekends. It was my grandfather's little shop, and it was a store for Brazilian tourists. My mother was Brazilian, is Brazilian. My father is Argentinian, and then but we were also Jewish in New York, and my father's name is Mario, and I always thought we were Italian, and so I was always very confused. There was a lot of like weird stuff growing up culturally, and I think that actually was responsible for for my interest in kind of more international stories. Even my interest in Love Means Zero came through a Brazilian connection, a Brazilian cousin who had gone to the Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy, and so I think that it's more of an international approach, which tends to bring in, I don't know, different ways of looking at stories, at the world, and I think that's the complexity is kind of a byproduct of that, and I realize that that's not like the most cohesive answer in the entire world, but in my head it makes a little bit more sense, because as far like I don't really go out looking to tell complex or looking at like complex institutions and thinking, oh wow, there's a story there. But I think that I am interested in in stories that have had impacts, kind of around the world, or relationships between things. Also, to be completely honest, maybe this also might have to do with the first movie that the first nonfiction film I ever saw that I absolutely loved and thought, oh well, this is a path to cinema in a way that I couldn't have imagined before. That was Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, which was very much about four unrelated things, and that might have been like such a touchstone film for me that in a way it shaped a possible way to make movies that I had never even thought about. And I don't know, maybe that is more influential than I even imagined. Nobody's actually ever asked me that question before.
Okay.
But this is also only my the third movie.
Third film, exactly.
And it's been a long time. So
And now coming to the subject of this film, what initially attracted you to such a specific and niche subject like the diamond industry, and was it clear to you the extent of the maze you would be entering?
Absolutely not. So I mean, diamonds for me were interesting for a few different reasons. One, back on where my grandfather's little shop was in Times Square back in a long time when Times Square was a little seedy, but it was right around the corner from the diamond district. So I felt like we always I grew up around this kind of diamond culture. My best friend growing up had a relationship to the diamond industry. And then my producing partner on Mandabala, he came from a diamond family. And so when I read about man-made diamonds, it felt like there was this sea change in this kind of niche little industry, but it not only a sea change, it felt like the industry was going to collapse. And what's, there was this piece of footage in the movie that I remember watching as a child. It was a Dateline, and it was an expose in the Russian diamond industry right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And and it's in the movie, and you kind of go into this vault and whatever. I remember watching that as a child with my mother. And that like had a profound effect on me, because I remember this clip about how many diamonds there were in the world, and how there was these stockpiles of diamonds, and I remember the conversation. I must have been like 10 or 11 years old. I don't, but I remember my mother had these, diamond earrings that she was so proud of. And I remember watching this thing that felt like, oh, well, diamonds are not quite as rare and precious as we all thought, even as a child. And yet my mother's diamond earrings were never any less precious to her. So there was this kind of like, in the face of physical evidence, of hard data, that these things are not so valuable, not so precious, they were still precious to her. And I always like felt this, I always thought that was very fascinating to me anyway. And when lab-grown diamonds came up, once again, I was like, here's this kind of evidence that this product that we hold so many people hold so dear, that are so precious, that carry so much so much symbolic power, and yet there's something about it that seems off. And I don't want to say too much about it, and I don't want to bring too many of my own, or I don't want to bring too many values or value judgments onto the diamond itself, because I think that that's what the movie allows the audience to kind of make up their own mind about. I just thought that the industry was going to be over, and yet it wasn't. And so again, a bad answer to a thoughtful and well-constructed question, but I didn't know how complicated, and I didn't know what kind of a rabbit hole we were getting into until, because I was fascinated by synthetic diamonds before I met the main character in the film, this gemologist. But when he came into the picture, all of a sudden I saw the potential for a much bigger story. Because at first it felt far more metaphoric. It was, I often think that my ideas start off way more in the world of kind of an impressionistic portrait film, or things that can kind of stand in for larger ideas. But this became a much more of a story. Yeah.
You mentioned already one of the characters, and in this documentary, interviewers and pundits, they don't look like the usual characters we see in documentaries. They really become true complex characters in the way you work with them. Does it depend mostly on how you choose them among many others who doesn't have maybe this potential, or it is the result of the process you set up with them?
All right, so that's another really good question. So there's two words that are often seen as pejoratives in nonfiction: casting and performance. And I feel like those are not only not pejoratives, but they're essential elements to all cinema, fiction or non. And I honestly also believe that a director's responsibilities in nonfiction are identical to those in fiction. If you have a wonderful set of collaborators and crew, low budget filmmaking, you have to do everything yourself, and that's or not everything. You have to wear many hats, but you still have a wonderful group of collaborators around you. But a director's still mainly responsible for the frame, and performance. and similar to fiction. Now, if you're a writer, director, you have a lot of other responsibilities, but I take these two responsibilities extremely seriously. And so finding characters that have the potential for subtext is essential, and that's part of the research and process that I consider casting. These are, they're human beings in our movies, but when they sit in front of a character and participate in a narrative experience, they also become characters in addition to human beings. And I actually think of them as two different things, right? There is Duchan, the human being, who I know and have become friends with. And then there's Duchan, the character, who is, manipulated like every subject in any movie, no matter what. And these are two different things, so another long-winded bad answer. Then after casting, I guess the issue then becomes performance, and performance is all about, for me anyway, it's all about this kind of chemistry that happens in the interview process, because I don't have questions ever. I have in my head, kind of this, list of curiosities and subjects that I want to discuss, and all of these things. And every once in a while, I'll write down a subject, that's important, I think, to the story. But by and large, these are real conversations that last hours and hours and hours, and that get very intense. So, in the beginning of this process, I used to joke that this is a character-based essay film with a plot. But that actually was no longer, at a certain point, that wasn't a joke, and it was a very, very, specific description of the movie that we had just made. And the character-based part of it, I think, is essential, because none of the characters in the film, a few of them have shorter segments, but the main characters anyway, it's very, very important why they're motivated to do what they do. And I think that's an essential part of any narrative structure. You have to understand why your characters are doing what they want to do. So the original title of the movie was actually Origin Stories, because I was not only interested in, the origin of the diamond and, what the origins of value are, but I was actually interested in each individual character's origin story and what set their particular values and principles in a way that would get them acting, or get them doing in the movie and saying in the movie what they said. This is a bad way to say it, but what their psychological touchstone in each one of their lives that kind of explains their perspective on the diamond industry as it relates to the film. It's something like that.
Okay, you said that with your characters we have conversations that go on for hours and hours. Unfortunately, we don't have all that time, so I try to move on with two questions, and let's see if we can still.
I should have warned you. I'm very long-winded.
No, it's fine. So here comes a quicker one for you. Can you tell us something more about these orphan film and video materials we see in the film? Corporate films, commercials, where you found them and how relevant they are to construct the balance of ideas and values that you work with in the film.
So that's an intense amount of research, which is also something that not only do I enjoy doing myself, but we also have an archival producer. So there was, there was a tremendous amount of energy that went into looking at the images that I think we all associate with the diamond industry, because I think the film, I was not interested in making anything that even had a tinge of advertising aesthetic in it. I didn't want anything to be aspirational, and I wasn't trying to denigrate anything also, but I was very sensitive to the idea of aspirational images, aspirational themes, aspirational characters. It's something that very much leaned away from. But at the same time, the entire diamond industry is based on aspirational images, aspirational themes, an aspirational aesthetic. Even going down to the fonts that you associate with the diamond industry, whether it's De Beers or Tiffany, there's something very elegant and aspirational about all of these things. So, but at the same time, if we weren't going to be creating those images in the film, it was extremely important because there's a psychology behind those images and that aesthetic. So I loved that training video because you actually see how the sausage is made a little bit. You see how aspirational ideas are created and they're not accidental. And so that was a really big deal. And in addition to all of the marketing, the old marketing and advertising material, these were essential components to understand the contradictions in the story. Because because we were not going to supply that in the original photography or in the ideas, which is actually something inherent to almost every single, either news piece or short documentary or anything I've ever seen about diamonds, even things that are critical of the diamond industry, even things that, break down or talk about subjects in the diamond industry, like blood diamonds that are, it's one of the most awful, historical components of the diamond industry that we didn't touch in this one because it was a different subject altogether. Even those things that are critical still indulge in aspirational image making. And that's something that really bothered me for some reason. Actually, not for some reason, just because the 3 or 4 of the worst years of my life were spent toiling in advertising, which is the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. But because I did that, I became very sensitive to those particular kinds of manipulations. And it was important, and it is important no matter what movie, that's never the point. I'm never trying to sell something, maybe an idea. So, but then what are they doing? They're just selling ideas. So maybe I'm full of shit. Who knows?
So we don't have time for the last question, but let's take the time anyway. And I was wondering to wrap this up. We usually consider, I was thinking, high tech and digital as domains in which we peer into our future. But what does the state of this diamond industry and the story you tell us means for us all, the idea of synthesis, the idea of synthetic? From this experience, from this exploration, have you come up with some impression that might not affect just the industry, but be relevant for all of us?
So, so much of the impetus for making this movie was in the symbolic and metaphoric power, I thought, of synthetic diamonds. The question of what is real and what is not real in a world, in which those distinctions are becoming more and more difficult to understand. The origin of where value comes from. These are fundamental questions to the beginning of the making of the film. Now, I couldn't anticipate where we would be culturally right now and how those questions have a different resonance right now, but it's only because those questions are perennial. It's only because I think, what attracted me to the story that cinematically was its relationship to Blade Runner, and similar questions about, I always thought of, the main character as a Blade Runner, this guy who has to differentiate between two things that are identical, and so I don't want to answer the question too specifically because I think that the point is to ask certain questions about, the nature of what we consider real, how we use that term. And I think that's that's the intention, is to create a movie that has a fun experience associated with asking some of those questions. And I think to answer your question more specifically, maybe, struggling with those questions is an essential part, I believe, of the human experience in one way or another. So whether or not, diamonds are both fundamentally one of the oldest things on Earth, but then again, so is like fucking the gasoline you put in your car and a pebble that you see on the stone, right? There's nothing inherently special about something that is old in a world where the crust is 4.5 billion years old in many places. You can see this stuff, right? Old is not necessarily the value, even though it is part of the idea of the diamond. And diamonds have been, were historically precious. But then there's this idea of this new diamond. I always thought that new diamonds were a much better marketing term for lab-made or synthetic diamonds, because that's the only real difference. These are younger, in age. And it does represent a certain kind of idea of I guess a fear that a lot of people have of certain ideas of certain, technologies in the future. How far can we go in terms of synthesis? I mean, again, I know that I'm answering this so long, I apologize, but the other part of the movie that kind of turned into another movie that I want to make has to do with the origins of life, and it started off together, origins of life and synthetic diamonds, because I thought that these were two interesting fields to think about in relationship to each other. And both of them represented, how a piece of technology, in this case, CVD technology for diamonds, how to make diamonds in the lab, how we were able to replicate a part of the natural world in the laboratory or in the factory. And I'm certainly not the first person to struggle with this idea. I mean, this has been, the subject of science fiction material forever. Even Battlestar Galactica, one of my favorite, TV series, not the more recent one, not the original, struggles with this idea in a profound and philosophical way that I fucking love, because it's also political. So, God, what a bad answer. Again, I can't do any more, early morning interviews.
I would suggest we keep the discussion of the origins of life for when you come here to Berlin, and we can go further into that.
I would love that.
And so, Jason, thank you very much for your time. And most of all, thank you very much for showing your film at Berlinale. And
thank you.
That's it. Thank you. Bye.
I appreciate it so much.